So first off, I'd like to congratulate you on being the first openly gay city councillor and representative in Hamilton, and also being an impactful activist within the community. So, and you're probably familiar with Hamilton being sort of a conservative and almost blue-collar town. It was built on primarily industry and blue-collar work. And over the years, it's had many changes, many impacts within the community. The history isn't talked a lot, but I wanted to ask, first question I wanted to ask is, growing up in Hamilton, what sort of things have you experienced in terms of, have you witnessed the community's involvement? Was there any hardships for you, growing up in Hamilton, that sort of thing?
Sure. So I was born in Hamilton at St. Joseph's Hospital in 1979, and I grew up in Westdale. And I came out early mid-90s when I was a high school student. Basically in grade 10, I started coming out to some friends. And by autumn of grade 12, I was totally out to the whole school. And I dealt with physical violence on a regular basis at my high school. I was physically assaulted on a semi-regular basis at the school. On one occasion, I had urine poured over my head. I was kicked downstairs at the school. So physical violence was certainly a regular peril. And psychological violence was daily, name-calling in particular. So homophobia, I think in many ways was more intense among youth, differently intense and more intense in the 90s. And those were pre-internet days. I did not have the internet at home in high school. A couple of my friends did, but I did not. And certainly the majority of youth did not have the internet in the 90s. And it made for a very different cultural moment. The LGBT movement was exploding in a lot of ways, but you had to access that through the community itself by physically going to community spots or through print material. Only dribbles of content on television. Every now and then something gay would pop up on network television, but it was rare. Ellen DeGeneres came out at the end of grade 12, and one of my teachers made a joke on the day of the airing of the Ellen DeGeneres Coming Out episode of her TV show, referring to Ellen Degenerate in front of the whole of the class. So it was that sort of time. In some ways, I think things are better. Certainly the internet has made a huge difference in terms of empowering gay youth and letting LGBT youth have a sense of identity and a sense of community and a sense of hope. So those are good things. But of course, homophobia and transphobia are alive and well. So we still have a lot of work to do in Hamilton specifically. When I was a teenager, I volunteered at the Hamilton AIDS Network, and that was a huge education for me and very much my introduction to gay community. And I feel very fortunate that I was able to have a sense of gay community in Hamilton as a teenager and to be part of the first generation to have that benefit. It made a huge difference in my own development, I think giving me a sense of confidence that I wouldn't have had otherwise. But the truth is, I got out of Hamilton as soon as I could at the end of grade 12. Many LGBT Hamiltonians choose to leave Hamilton simply because of the deep homophobia and transphobia in our city. Most LGBT people with wherewithal and means find their way to Toronto, where the community is so much bigger and where the city itself is so much more accepting and diverse. I think it's a big challenge that Hamilton has, asserting itself as the little city compared to Toronto. When I was in high school, we had an LGBT bookstore in Hamilton, believe it or not, and it was Gomorrah's Books. And the joke in the name Gomorrah's Books was, we're the other small city by the lake, with Toronto being Sodom. And I still like that joke a lot. I still think of Hamilton as Gomorrah. We can hold our own by the lake.
That's great. Even knowing that there is some sort of network at that time or some sort of place to go to, it means a lot for the community just to have somewhere to connect with people, or to even know more about themselves, for people to know about themselves. I know that especially in schools in Hamilton, there is a significant problem with just homophobia, transphobia, pretty much everything like that. I know that in 2011, the Hamilton Wentworth Catholic District School Board sent out almost a document saying that they didn't want any gay propaganda in schools, and I remember reading that and thinking, well, how are you helping your students? How are you making them better people when you're not letting them be able to find safe places? So I know that you had talked a little bit about that. Do you still think that that is an issue nowadays for students?
Well, certainly. The abuses that I suffered in high school kindled in me a love of the law and a love of civil liberties. And that led me to become a lawyer. And when I graduated from law school, one of the first projects I got to work on was the fight against the ban on gay-straight alliance clubs in the Catholic school boards of Ontario. And we made great headway there. And we're at a point where Catholic school boards broadly acknowledge that they have to obey the law. They have to affirm the equality of their LGBT students. And certainly they cannot ban gay-straight alliance clubs. In terms of the Catholic community specifically, something remarkable happened here in Hamilton last year. The Catholic community and a diversity of other religious communities and cultural communities came out to support the transgender protocol work in our city. About 2 years ago, a transgender woman attempted to use the bathroom, female bathroom, at McNabb bus terminal, and a city employee interfered with her attempting to use the female bathroom. She was very hurt by this, and so she took legal action against the city. And a conversation began about how to respond to this lawsuit. Many of us together created what I consider to be a good result. Instead of fighting this particular litigation, the city agreed to settle. And we settled in an appropriate way in that we created the Transgender Protocol, which is the first bylaw in Canada at a municipal level to define the public space access rights of transgender citizens. And it's heads and shoulders, a different universe almost, from the homophobia and transphobia that were everywhere in the 90s when I was a high school student. In other words, we're taking real steps away from the past and into a better future. And the day of hearings that we had here at City Hall regarding the content and the specifics of the transgender protocol were very moving to a lot of people. The Sisters of St. Joseph, who run St. Joseph's Hospital here in Hamilton, provided a letter calling on the city to affirm transgender dignity and transgender equality. The local Aboriginal community delegated on the Two-Spirit tradition, which is really where queer history in Hamilton begins. Well before white people came to Hamilton, we know that there were Indigenous peoples upon these lands who were living, for lack of another terminology, alternative gender identities and alternative gender expressions, sometimes shamanic. And this Two-Spirit tradition has endured and is an evolving tradition in the First Nations. And we heard all about that, remarkably, here at Hamilton City Hall, of all places, in the context of our transgender protocol hearings. Our local First Nations argued at City Hall that affirming gender identity equality and gender expression equality is tied to the truth and reconciliation process, is tied to finding justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and trans folk and Two-Spirit people, is tied to the overall project of Indigenous dignity and of government reconciliation. So that was a powerful day on a bunch of fronts. And transgender voices were heard at City Hall, perhaps the most important breakthrough of all.
I know that transgender rights has been a thing that needs to be pushed forward, and it was so great that that was pushed through and supported by many people coming together to put that through. It's really difficult in Hamilton to sort of just advocate for something like that, and knowing that a big portion of the city is very traditional, very we haven't seen a whole lot of change we haven't seen a whole lot of change within the 90s, but now it's starting to progress, and now we're starting to realize we're trying to get everybody together and to basically make a safer place for everybody. So congratulations on.
No, thank you. I think we're getting from theory to practice,
Mm-hmm.
and it's slow.
Progress, it takes time, but it'll get there. So.
And I think history is an important part of it,
Mm-hmm.
and the telling of history. So thank you very much for recording history.
There's another question I wanted to ask too about history as well in Hamilton. We have seen a lot of we had community centers, we had a lot of places that basically were trying to push for rights as well, and a lot of them have sort of faded and sort of disappeared. I know that one community place in Hamilton, known as The Well, it wasn't as big as some of the places in Toronto, but it definitely has had an impact on people, but people have seen it disappear over the years. I know that many activists within Hamilton are saying that we need to look back on our history, we need to kind of fight for these things to go back, we need to have some sort of support networks, we need to have this. Do you think that a better awareness of the history of LGBT community within Hamilton is sort of needed to kind of progress and keep going forward?
Absolutely. I think that when we understand history, particularly the history of marginalized communities, we see the depth of problems, which is a provocation to our consciences. But perhaps more importantly, and perhaps most importantly for young people, younger people, we encounter stories that inspire us. So the story of the LGBTQ community in Hamilton is full of sadness and full of scary things, beatings and violence and death and AIDS and hate. So on the one hand, the story is very depressing. However, on the other hand, it's full of stories of inspiration, coming out stories, and stories of people asserting their dignity through coming out and through simply living their lives in the face of hate and achieving great things. The transgender protocol work in Hamilton last year, which I bring up again because it's relevant, was an achievement of the transgender community. The trans community said enough is enough, led by a woman who simply wanted to use the bathroom in peace. And they called for change, and they worked together for change. That is, members of the trans community worked together for change. And they achieved it. And I think about their work and their example every single day, and I draw inspiration from it. So we see that when we look at the history, there are sad and frightening stories, but also very beautiful stories and stories of love. It's something particular about LGBTQ history, I would say, the diversity of it. You referred to the need for a community center. We absolutely need a community center, and it needs to be an intersectional, equity-seeking community center. The bars hardly exist anymore. I don't think there's a gay bar left in Hamilton. Is there one or two?
There was.
Maybe one has reopened since I've last asked.
It had quite a problem with police raids and I think thievery, vandalism, and it was struggling to kind of hold together. It might have been revamped since then, but I know that it was the most notable place in Hamilton, and it was just wiped off the map.
I'm thinking of the Steel Lounge, our wonderful dyke bar, which, I don't know the whole inside story of the Steel Lounge not succeeding, but it was a true community space, and the women who were captaining the Steel Lounge were making a valiant effort to create a business that was also a true community space. I was going to say a justice-seeking and comfort-creating community space, which is precisely what it was. However, the dark side of the internet is the internet draws us into solitary lives, and people are cruising online, they're meeting their partners online, they're arranging their dates online and their social lives online. And young people in particular feel much less of a need for physical spaces to brush elbows with strangers. And therefore, a vital element has been taken out of LGBTQ community life with the decline and the death of the gay bar scene. And you're pointing to a vacuum, and we need to fill that vacuum with a real community space. I strongly agree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the online world can definitely be sort of empty as well too. Even with the rise of the internet too, we see, and even lately, a bigger spike in HIV rates and STD rates too. And I've noticed that there was a huge complaint about the access to resources for the community within Hamilton specifically. Wait times are bad, the times to go are bad, like there's just not enough resources to handle an influx. Do you think that there's still sort of that kind of demand from the community?
Absolutely. The good news is that the AIDS network continues to be there and does great work and continues to be the closest thing to a queer community hub that we have in Hamilton at its location. Another promising sign, the Hamilton Community Legal Clinic is attempting to create an LGBTQ outreach project right now with a two-spirit lens. And I find that another very hopeful sign.
Yeah, very good. Another thing too is with the with all this going on, what was the biggest sort of goal within your campaign to become a city councillor? Were you aiming to make change directly with the community? Were there any sort of were there obstacles? Were there challenges?
In the campaign?
Yes.
Sure. So when I was running, my primary opponent was female, a really wonderful woman. And I strongly believe that we need gender parity in politics. I think it's a big problem that we've never had a female mayor in Hamilton, or a person of color as mayor of Hamilton, or an openly queer person as mayor of Hamilton. But how can I put this? I look forward to the day when we have an openly queer mayor, a female mayor, a person of color serving as mayor. And I ran for office on a platform of justice seeking and on a promise to assist marginalized communities to the best of my ability. So, and I was openly gay in my campaign. A joke, if you can call it that, circulated in the ward during the campaign, referring to my sexuality and the femaleness of my primary opponent. And the joke was, why vote for half a woman, referring to me, when you could vote for a whole woman, referring to my opponent? This joke is perhaps even more misogynistic than it is homophobic, although it is both. I mean, I don't think quantifying is it more homophobic or more misogynistic is really the point. To joke, why vote for half a woman when you could vote for a whole woman, is degrading to women, is degrading to the LGBTQ community, and the joke circulated in the ward. I did get some homophobic responses at doors. I knocked on every door in the ward when I was campaigning and certainly received some homophobic indications at some doors. For the most part, though, I would say my sexual orientation was not a factor. And conversely, many people in the ward looked to my LGBTQ community work, my AIDS activist work, etc., as qualifications for the role. So there was a lot of anti-homophobia in the ward too. I would say that in the final analysis that my sexual orientation was a wash in the campaign. I think that there were anti-gay votes, but there were also pro-gay votes. And in the end, I think the majority of Ward 1ers made up their mind based on meritocracy, simply who would be the best councillor. I think the majority of Ward 1ers, and indeed the majority of Hamiltonians, are enlightened enough to ultimately realize that as human beings, we have much more in common with one another than we have anything that divides us. And so I think ultimately I was voted in meritocratically, but it's a complicated story.
No, you did do a lot for the community too, and a lot of people can definitely see that. We need a lot of people in government that just go out there and try to make the world a better place, and that's exactly what you're doing out there.
Trying, thank you.
And it's difficult facing the world like that, being the sort of first, being the one who kind of puts the changes out there and just faces it head on. I know that within my Catholic school too, I helped to start up a positive space group within that.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and I had written the article that you wrote too, and it was just very, very inspiring to keep going with it.
Thank you.
It's, you know, having somebody, especially in a leadership role, out there all the time, and even just saying, just pushing for all these changes, it's, you know, a lot of people will see that everybody's just the same. You know, there's no, why are we separating? Why are we dividing people? Why are we, you know, everybody should be one community. The whole city should be all together. It shouldn't be as divided as it used to be. So hopefully we can push for more changes as the whole community of Hamilton as a whole, and make the city a better place. So,
as RuPaul says, everybody say love.
You watch the show a lot, yeah?
Passionately.
I've never gotten into it, but I've wanted to. So, yeah. Well, thank you for taking the time to say a few words. Yeah, it was very nice meeting you.
And thank you for recording our history.